How are you doing?
Yes, I am doing very well, Dr. Zeufack. How are things? I am Denis Foretia. I am the executive chairman of the Nkafu Policy Institute. I'm based in Yaoundé, in Cameroon, and the co-chair of the Denis and Lenora Foretia Foundation. And it gives me great honor and privilege to actually be having this conversation with Dr. Albert Zeufack at a very difficult time in the world, and certainly at a very difficult time for Africa. We are going through a significant phase in the world today, and we are meeting at a time when African countries are facing enormous challenges, particularly with the ballooning youth unemployment in the continent, as well as underemployment. And despite the fact that the continent is the youngest continent in the world today, we have still not been able to reap the demographic dividends from this youthness in the community, in the continent. At the same time, we know that for the last 25 years, Africa has seen positive growth. And really, we did have about 7 countries in Africa who were the leading economies as far as growth rate was concerned, around the world. The growth that we saw in the last 2 decades has been driven by a lot about trade and also a lot about global partnerships. And we know that China's Belt and Road Initiative has been really one of the most extensive initiatives yet of a single country, but the European Union as a whole is not really far behind. The United States last year launched Prosper Africa as a way to look about deepening its engagement with African countries. And as we know, the US is currently the leading foreign direct investor in the continent. But with all of this, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really thrown a major wrench on the economic and socio-political outlook of the continent. And we are indeed very honored to have Dr. Zeufack join us today to really help us begin to understand the dynamics that are shaping, the response to COVID around the continent, and what African countries need to do and should be doing to be able to be better prepared, especially for the subsequent economic downturn that this would undoubtedly engineer. Dr. Zeufack is the chief economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. Prior to his appointment in 2016, he was the practice manager in the macroeconomics and fiscal management global practice and the leader of the World Bank-wide community of practice for the management of natural resources. And he has his main interest in the micro foundations of macroeconomics. So Dr. Zeufack, it's indeed a great honor again for me to welcome you here today.
Thank you very much, Denis. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
And just to get started, I'll let everyone know on the who is attending that please go ahead. We'll be taking questions, so please keep sending us your questions. We did receive close to 70 questions from those who registered to attend, and we are glad to know that we have more than 15 countries represented on the call today. So this is wonderful. But Albert, we'll go ahead and get started quickly. Now, you are in the center of the response to COVID, especially with regards to the African continent and what African governments should be doing. Let's just start by you giving us your current take as to where we are in the continent today.
Denis, thank you so much for that. We are living unprecedented times. This is the worst pandemic for a very long time. And it's translating into not only the worst economic crisis globally since the Second World War, but it's also translating in the first recession in sub-Saharan Africa for the past 25 years. But it's also potentially a health crisis. It's also potentially a food security crisis. And this all combined, so the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the potential food crisis make it extremely, extremely serious. So let me start with just 2 simple but important messages. Africa, despite a late start in this pandemic, has not been spared. And it's not over yet. It is extremely serious. It's important for populations across Africa to understand that we are not even yet at the tip of the curve, as contamination rate is still increasing across Africa. So first, it's extremely serious. It's real. I'm still hearing people questioning if COVID is real or not. People are dying across Africa. It's serious. It's very, very serious. I think that's important. Second, it's not over yet. So we need to all continue to mobilize to fight this crisis. And Denis, where are we today? Globally, this pandemic has affected more than 8 million people as we speak, with more than 400,000 deaths across the world, of which more than 100,000 in the USA alone. In Africa, because of the late start, as of June 15, there were more than 172,000 people affected, with more than 4,000 deaths and counting. In a country that I know, which is Cameroon, my own country, we are above 9,000 cases as of June 15. And again, Africa CDC is warning that the rate of contamination is not only, high, but it's increasing over the past couple of weeks. So, Denis, the first message I want to give is that let's take this extremely seriously. Let's not relax. As countries start to reopen, let's be smart about ending the confinement measures. Let's make sure we don't contribute to worsening the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you very much for that. And, one of the things that we have seen is the difference in responses from different countries in the continent. There have been countries that have gone on very stringent lockdown. The Ghanaians are a good example of that. And then you have folks like, Cameroon, where except for really locking down the border, closing the border, you really didn't have any serious concerted effort to minimize community spread. Across the board, as you look at the continent across the board, what has been the varied responses that governments have thrown at the pandemic? And what are the lessons that you are beginning to learn from these varied responses?
Policy responses to this pandemic have been varied across the world. But let me, before we get into the policy response, give you a little bit more details as to how that impact is materializing in our countries. The first important aspect that we're seeing is because of the sudden stop in global trade. A lot of countries, serious economic contraction. We had a collapse in import and export. We had a collapse in commodity prices that have essentially been the main source of revenue for our country. So immediately, right from the start, we had a fiscal crunch, a fiscal crisis in our countries. Countries that are producing oil, for example, most of them budgeted at around $50 to $60 per barrel. In April, the barrel dropped to below $30. So we have first the big shock on the fiscal side that countries are all struggling to face. The second area where countries were really, really hit hard is the collapse in financial flows. Foreign direct investment experienced a sudden stop. And you can see a number of investment projects across Africa that have certainly stopped. So those resources are no longer flowing. To the contrary, we saw an outflow of capital from countries like South Africa, emerging markets in Africa. We saw a massive outflow of capitals. Then if you add to that the decline in tourism revenues, if you add to that the decline and even the collapse in remittances by more than 20% of the volume of remittances, then you realize at what point our economies are going to be affected. A third channel, very, very important, is the health channel itself, as many people are getting sick, therefore not working, and that is translating in less output. And the fact that confinement measures and strict lockdown policies in countries like South Africa, as you have mentioned, have led to a sudden stop in economic activity, also translate into that shock on the economy. But it's not only on the growth rate that we are seeing that impact. We're seeing that on the income of household, on household welfare. And that's where the policy response needed to really be attuned to the specificities of our economies. And this is something in our publication, The Africa's Pulse, in April, we clearly signal. It is important for our policy responses to really, match the structure and the peculiarities of our economies. So, to your question on how did countries react and how, what were the consequences to that? Number of countries adopted border closing. Number of them adopted strict lockdown policies, such as South Africa. A number of them adopted, confinement policies, confinement measures. But by and large, number of countries all adopted the basic protective measures, such as washing hands, wearing masks, and wearing protective gears, especially for medical personnel. All those were good measures. But what is quite clear is that we could not sustain those strict lockdown in a number of our countries because most of our economy is informal. And because it's informal, it relies on people actually being out there in contact with others to survive. Most people live hand to mouth in the informal sector. So those responses that were very, very draconian could not be sustained. And we're now seeing some reopening, and reopening is also happening in a very disorderly way. So let me stop there and hear from you.
Yeah, so Albert, thank you very much for that. And I think, to push further on the issues of how the pandemic is, is impacting the informal economy, jobs, youth, SMEs. I think, it will be important for us to get your thoughts on how directly, the youth unemployment and jobs and the problems with SMEs that we already have on the continent. How is this impact further exemplified? How are we seeing this, play out? We know that already SMEs, contribute more than 40% of the national income in many sub-Saharan African countries of the GDP. And we know that, as you've mentioned, more than 70% of the workforce is in the informal sector in many of our countries, Cameroon, Nigeria, all pretty much the same thing. And there are many countries, mine included, that do not have social safety nets. So it becomes extremely difficult to actually respond to this. Can you say a little bit about African SMEs and the way they are dealing with the brunt of COVID-19 as well as youth and jobs?
Absolutely. Denis, I think you touched on a very, very important point. Let me step back a little bit and tell you about how I see a coherent and cohesive policy response. It would have to include 3 pillars. One, a pillar on health that is basically fighting to save lives, protecting lives on the health side. A second pillar on protecting livelihoods, and that's where protection of firms, both in the formal and informal sector, that it comes, and also includes protecting household using social protection mechanisms such as cash transfers, as you certainly alluded to. And the third pillar of a good policy response is actually protecting the future in a way that we do not forget about sowing the seeds of recovery during this time where we're fighting the emergency. Because the crisis is also a huge opportunity for African economies. So coming back to that second pillar of protecting livelihoods, number of measures can be adopted across Africa. A number of African countries have adopted some of these measures, and they are both fiscal and monetary. On the fiscal side, what countries are certainly doing, and that's the right thing to do, is to give some fiscal incentive or some fiscal relief to firms, delaying tax payment, delaying rent payment, delaying bills payment for utilities, for example. That would allow those small firms to still have the liquidity to continue operating, because the one thing you want to avoid is a sudden stop of economic activity, because the cost to restart is always very, very high. And some of the firms in crisis that close never reopen. So it's important for countries to support that industrial or private sector fabric, and that should be done in collaboration with the private sector. On the monetary side, number of countries are actually getting central banks to step in to provide for interest-free loans, or restructuring firms' debt, and ensuring that they can actually have cheaper liquidity to continue functioning. Number of central banks have actually reduced their main rate to commercial banks, so that small firms also can access credit during this time and access it at favorable rates. So it's both fiscal and monetary policies that needs to be combined at this time to support firms, both in the formal and informal sectors. But on the informal firms, one thing that we are finding in our work is that they are probably best reached through social protection, because some of them don't pay taxes, so they won't be able to actually benefit from tax holidays. So it would be useful to actually widen the net of social protection through cash transfers, for example, that would allow those household enterprises to survive.
So, very great. One of the things, as you talk about regarding the fiscal response and monetary response, is as you alluded to earlier, you have a lot of these countries where depended heavily on commodities, and we had the problems with commodity prices, which we still do. You have the second scenario where it's the oil producers and the price of per barrel haven't dropped significantly, really reducing revenues. We have the issues of remittances dropping precipitously, and it is rightfully putting a lot of these countries under a serious financial crunch. The other thing to add to the equation is the fact that a lot of our African countries have had lots of external debt. So we do have now averagely external debt ranging from 50 to 60% of GDP or so. And it is putting significant pressure on these countries in how they respond. How do you think these countries should go about trying to raise the revenue that is necessary, that is required for them to actually undertake these interventions that are necessary?
The issue of creating the fiscal space to fight COVID is one that is on the table of every economist or every policymaker. One thing that is absolutely clear in my mind is that no single African country alone is going to be able to successfully fight COVID, because the magnitude of the shock is just so large that, no country has the fiscal space to fight it alone. Countries like South Africa have actually done a huge sacrifice by putting a fiscal stimulus of close to 10% of GDP. It's still not enough. And it is clearly not something any or many African countries can actually afford. Most of the African countries can afford 1 to 3 percentage point of GDP in fiscal stimulus. And even if they were able to go to 5%, it still won't be enough. So the question is, where can they find that fiscal space? Because we need to spend to fight the disease. Well, one is debt. And as you said, unfortunately, entering the COVID-related crisis, African debt has been rising. Levels of debt have been rising significantly. And from the early 2000s, where we had the debt relief package, the HIPIC, to 2018, we had some countries in Africa increasing their debt to GDP ratio by 5-fold. So, we've seen countries increasing their debt from the low 20s to close to 50s. And when countries are close to the bar of 70% to GDP, we all start really getting extremely worried, because that's already the sign of lack of sustainability. But it's worse than that, because debt has also seen a change in composition in African countries that has led us to probably issuing more commercial type of paper. We have been issuing bonds at pretty high interest rates, and some private bilaterals have also been lending to Africa at commercial rates. So this debt service has become a huge burden on our budget again, and that's a serious issue. So without really addressing the issue of debt, we won't have the fiscal space to really address it. And that's why the World Bank and IMF came in and proposed the debt standstill, where for the next 2 years, countries could actually be forgiven the debt service payment and probably shift it backward. It's not a debt forgiveness, but it's actually just creating that space for countries to really have the resources, immediate resources to fight COVID. That was done, but that's clearly not going to be enough neither. African countries need to also take the opportunity of this crisis, Denis, to really look inside and create those avenues for better revenue mobilization. And one of them is actually just increasing the efficiency of our public spending. Number of our public expenditure, especially those in investment, the investment budget, tend to be not very effective. We do have the Public Investment Management Index that is published by the IMF that suggests that we can do better in terms of selecting the right projects, implementing them, monitoring their impact. We're not doing a good job on spending our own money. So we could get some savings already by increasing the efficiency of our public spending. And then there is corruption, the C word, right? So number of countries are still suffering from high level of corruption, and that is actually preventing us from getting that fiscal space we need to fight this horrible pandemic. So it's about, relying on external sources and friends through debt standstill or some form of debt relief, but also creating that fiscal space from within. And there's still a number of large enterprises that do not pay taxes in our countries, and some large and very rich individuals that do not pay taxes neither. So it's important to address those issues.
Yeah, so I think we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But I wanted us to segue a little bit to talk about, you had alluded to earlier that the COVID pandemic, in as much as it's a health, crisis, it's an economic, crisis, but at the same time, it could really, really torpedo, and we've seen it in our country, in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, really lead to a significant food insecurity. And agriculture, as we know, African countries continue to spend at least $35 billion a year, just in agricultural imports annually. And Africa has more than 60% of the arable land. And the issue right now, especially with the pandemic, is how do we respond from an agriculture standpoint and food sufficiency standpoint? How can the countries, respond to this and use this as an opportunity to rethink agriculture? If I may so suggest, rethink agriculture, change it from something of subsistence to more of a business, and ensure that we can really valorize agriculture and be ready to feed ourselves.
That's a fundamental question, Denis, and it's also linking to this discussion we already started on really taking the crisis as an opportunity to reinvent our economies and reinvent ourselves. On food crisis, on the potential food crisis, what our projections show is that because of a drop in imports, and you're right, Africa imports between $35 and $40 billion per year of food, while having the largest area of arable land, which is a paradox. But second, what has also happened is that, because of confinement measures, because of the constraint on people's movement, agricultural output may also be affected. And we are actually projecting a decline in agricultural output by between 2 to 7%, depending on the scenario, depending on how long the crisis would be. So it's also important to highlight that when the crisis hit, we were already suffering an invasion of locusts in East Africa, yes. And that coincided with the harvesting season, right? The harvesting season in West Africa, it was the planting season, so people may not have planted when they needed to. So output of agriculture may go down significantly. And that may put more than 130 million more people in risk of food insecurity. And these are numbers from the World Food Programme. So this is a serious issue, and we should really take this opportunity as a way to rethink our agriculture. Dennis, last year my office produced a report, and one of the findings that really struck me was that when you look at the number of poor in Africa, 82% of all the poor in Africa live from subsistence agriculture. Wow. So we cannot fight poverty in Africa successfully as long as we do not transform our agriculture. We need to raise productivity in our agriculture. We need to move to really putting ourselves in a position not only to feed the whole Africa, but feed the world. We can do it if we can transform our agriculture. So that's absolutely critical. But one thing that is also crucial for not only agriculture, but for economic recovery, is that a number of countries have closed borders. Mm-hmm. Our research suggests, Denis, that if countries continue closing borders, especially closing borders to trade, the impact of COVID on African economies is going to be more severe. So it's important, as we restrict movement of people, to treat workers in the food supply chain as essential workers and keep trade going on within Africa. This would be the opportunity, probably, to increase intra-Africa trade and therefore hopefully build those regional value chains that are needed for Africa to feed itself and to become more prosperous.
No, thank you very much for that, Albert. And I think as we segue to talk about trade, and I will let the attendees know, we'll take some questions after this. With the confinement measures and the border closures, we realized, as we saw in many African countries, that the population, the entrepreneurs were able to step up, to produce masks, PPEs, things that, in the past would just be imported. When pushed to the wall, we all responded very positively. And we know that is what it is. We have the ingenuity, the technical know-how to be able to step up, to make sure that our line manufacturing can take off, that our different industries can be strengthened. And I wanted you to, use a few minutes, to talk about the whole aspect of how this pandemic, affects the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And many people are looking at this as the ripe opportunity to accelerate trade, free, fair trade across the continent, to ensure that we can build these value chains locally. And business mindsets are changing significantly, where people are less inclined to depend on China, for certain products or so. How from your vantage point, how does this play into the narrative of the Africa Continental Free Trade?
Coming into this crisis, my sense is Africa had actually proven to the world that we can innovate. We enacted the Continental Free Trade Agreement at a time where all countries were already closing their borders. And Africa actually took the opposite direction and created the largest free trade area in the world. So this is the opportunity. I believe COVID is giving us that opportunity to really implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement. You did mention manufacturing, Denis, and let me take the case of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, before the crisis, had been investing massively in industrial zone to produce textile and export blue jeans, suits to the US market, and firms producing all the garments, mostly for Europe or for the US. And they were exporting cut flowers to Europe all over. And when the crisis hit, Ethiopia invested in converting its manufacturing firms. Instead of producing blue jeans, they started producing PPE. They started producing protective gears that they were exporting now, including exporting to Latin America. So it is the case that some governments that are organized can actually seize this as an opportunity to really start doing what economists would call import substitution. And in that case, it was absolutely necessary because there was no import to get anywhere. The few masks or PPE that were available were confiscated by the large economies because they were all fighting that disease as well. So this is an opportunity for Africa to definitely rethink industrial policy. And industrial policy is not just protecting inefficient firms, it's to actually set the stage and create the right infrastructure, the right environment for small, efficient, productive firms to grow bigger and to sell across borders. This is the time to do it.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions right now from some of the attendees. We have Jean-Cédric Kwam. Dr. Kwam, can you ask your question to Dr. Zeufack?
Thank you, Dr. Denis, for giving me the floor. I'm Dr. Kwam from Nkafu Policy Institute at Yaoundé. I'm a French speaker, but I will try to ask my question in English.
Ask in French.
Well, you can speak in French. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Merci, Dr. Denis, de me passer la parole. Je suis, comme je disais tantôt, Dr. Jean-Cédric Kwam de analyse des politiques économiques à Nkafu Policy Institute à Yaoundé. J'ai deux questions à poser au Dr. Albert Zeufack. La première question est celle de savoir face à la chute des cours des matières premières et au ralentissement des échanges commerciaux, quelles solutions préconisez-vous aux États africains pour remonter la courbe et retrouver le niveau d'équilibre avant Covid? Parce qu'on sait que nos économies dépendent foncièrement des thèmes de l'échange et elles sont extraverties, elles sont les pays sont preneurs de prix. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a un moyen de retrouver le sentier d'équilibre d'avant Covid? Ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question est celle de savoir, pensez-vous que la création et la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, la ZLECAf qui vient d'être mise en œuvre, permettra à l'Afrique de retrouver, de rebondir après le COVID-19? Donc, voilà les deux principales questions.
Merci, merci.
For the English folks on the line, Dr. Kwam was asking about the decrease in the fall in commodity prices and how should African countries respond. The second question was about the Africa Continental Free Trade and how African countries should respond. I think the second one, Dr. Zeufack has answered already, but no, Albert, do you want to do the first?
Very good. No, second question, yes, I've elaborated on it before. The first question is a more interesting one. First of all, because entering the crisis, which is earlier 2020, I cannot actually believe that resource-rich African countries were on a growth path that was actually acceptable, right? Let me just give you a few numbers. Sub-Saharan Africa, in average, we had projected would only grow by 2.4% in 2019. And that was before COVID. And if you break that rate into commodity exporters and non-exporters, commodity exporters in Sub-Saharan Africa would have grown by less than 1%. So that's not actually an equilibrium path. That's not an enviable growth path that you would want. In fact, oil exporting countries, especially those in Central Africa, were dragging the average down because they had not been recovering well from the 2014-2016 oil price and mineral price collapse. So there is something that is clear about growth in Africa. Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa are all mineral and oil rich. And because of the volatility in prices in those commodities, these economies tend to have very, very low growth rate, in the long term. So this is not a model of development that we can sustain. I know economists in Francophone Africa, especially those in oil-rich countries, like to sit and cry over extraversion of prices, but what have we been doing to diversify our economies? We need to diversify away from natural resources if we are to have stable and high growth rates, not volatile growth rates, as I see in a number of them. So it is important to put back the issue of diversification of our economies. And it is the case that, economists know about the Dutch disease. When oil prices are high, generally there is no reform that is done in oil exporting countries. And when oil prices are down, then we start complaining, right? So it is important to really anchor the debate on diversification and on stabilization and what economists call the counter-cyclical fiscal policies. When oil prices were high, what did we do with the money, right? Basic economics will teach you that when oil prices are high, you save for the rainy days. But in 2014, Africa was coming out of a 10-year boom in oil prices. What did we do with the money, right? If we had saved that money, we could have been investing in the downturn and growth rate would not go down that much. So I think that's the real issue. Our economic model is based on commodities and we sit and watch prices and watch their volatility and complain, we should take the opportunity of this crisis to diversify away from commodity, or at least add value to those commodities that would create jobs for the youth, as Dr. Foretia mentioned earlier. The main issue, and if I can sum all this discussion in one word, it's jobs. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zeufack, we'll use the remaining 5-10 minutes to round up. And you ended up on the topic of jobs. And I think this is really the most important aspect of this conversation. It's about jobs. So from my personal perspective, there is no, growth is good, but growth does not put food on someone's table. What puts food on someone's table is good paying jobs that puts food on someone's table. We know in the United States, we've had at least, we had about 20 million folks lost their job already from COVID-19. And that is worsening the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. So jobs. Now, I have two-part question. First, why is it that our African countries have not prioritized a focus on job creation, as in the primary indicator of progress in their countries? Like you see in many industrialized countries that don't talk about growth, they talk about real paying jobs, how many people are employed. Why is it that we have not focused on that? And why is it that organizations and multilaterals like, the World Bank, you guys, have not insisted that, or maybe have not insisted enough that these countries should really focus on the number of jobs driving unemployment down? That's one thing. The second thing is, how do we maximize the opportunity that COVID presents for a post-COVID Africa? And that to me is an issue of, when you look across the board, you have countries that are well-governed versus countries that are not well-governed. Countries where there is a rule of law versus countries that you don't have as much rule of law. It would seem to me that for any significant structural transformation, the issue of broad-based governance has to be prioritized more so than tactical, short-term engagements. What are your thoughts on those two things?
Very, very important issues, Denis, and your perspective is very, very interesting here. Focus on job. On the focus on job, let me reassure you, this is really at the center of what we are doing in the Africa region of the World Bank. My office is coming out, this July with a report on industrializing for jobs. And we will be talking about it. We would probably have the opportunity to actually share that even more widely, including on this forum. The main issue, is that when we say creating jobs, in a number of countries, we still hear this as meaning the government will create jobs, will give jobs to people, right? While actually, all over the world, the experience is that it's the private sector that creates the largest number of jobs. So the question when you start discussing jobs is to ask, what are the conditions you are creating in your country for entrepreneurship to flourish? Is the civil service there to repress and extract rents from the private sector, or to facilitate their growth? That's the fundamental question. And I leave you, in each country to think and answer that question. Is the civil service there to facilitate and promote growth of firms, or is it stifling growth of firms? If you stifle growth of firms, you're stifling employment creation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is in our jobs a strategy that we advise countries on. The second thing is the digital economy. When we are discussing jobs these days, it's important to realize that the digital is going to be the way of the future. And if there was any doubt, if someone was still thinking that the digital is a luxury for Africa, COVID has actually proven the contrary. When we went on lockdown and all those countries that had the right infrastructure on the digital side are those that kept some level of transaction and some economic activity going. So the digital is going to be crucial, and most of the jobs are going to be either created by the digital or enabled by the digital. So it's important for countries, for job creation, to invest in making sure we have the right digital infrastructure. There is evidence, Denis, now in economics and academic settings that investing in broadband, making sure everybody has access to broadband, is good for productivity of firms and it's good for workers, because as they become more productive, their income increases, right? So it's important to invest in the digital. It's important to create the condition for private sector to really flourish. And it's also important, and you mentioned this, to ensure that there is good governance, right? That there is clear rules of the game. One thing I'm going to say, Denis, is it's also very easy to point the finger at the World Bank or IMF, and we're used to that. But the thing is, we are just advisors. And I like to say that, I don't know of any country that has been developed by someone else. Countries develop when they decide to do so, and they get the help they need to advance, right? So the question is, what are we putting in place in our countries and showing clearly that we want to solve those problems? When you do that, then advice can be useful. Otherwise, advice is useless. And I can tell you this in confidence because working for more than 10 years in East Asian countries, I realize how important is the conception and the will, the political will to develop. My counterparts in East Asia were certainly not smarter than all the brilliant Africans I know, but they all had one thing in common. They all wanted their country to be the best in the world. Can we say that across Africa? Because if we do that, from tomorrow morning, things will start changing.
Well, that is, Dr. Zeufack, that is very on point. I would ask one last question from Mr. Elvis Bionga for you, Dr. Zeufack, and that would be, we'll be able to close that.
Yes, so thank you so much, Doctor. Quite a fantastic and exciting presentation which you had there going, and it's such an interesting conversation. So my question basically is to understand, first of all, I work with the World Resources Institute. I'm the head of Africa's communications. So my question is basically, what can Africa do to build back better in other words, what can we do after this? Because we have been talking about the crash of the environment, and obviously the economy has not been listening. So my question is, what do we need to build back better in an eco-friendly manner to make sure that despite the fact that we have this problem, but we don't crash our planet or our environment? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think you're raising a very important point there on making sure as we recover, that we also recover in a sustainable way. And this is something that is essential. When you look at climate change across Africa and the way it's affecting our economy, we can no longer think of climate change as just being an add-on in the development agenda. Let me just give you a couple of examples. One, in the Sahel, the way the desert is coming down is shrinking the size of Lake Chad. Lake Chad has lost more than 90% of its water in 20 years, right? And number of places that used to be green in the Sahel are now disappearing under the sand. So that is actually leading to conflict as herders and farmers are fighting over arable land for grazing. So you have conflict from climate change. You have coastal erosion in West Africa, actually threatening our cities. And you certainly know most of the population of Africa lives around that coast, right? Around the coast, our largest cities are coastal. You have coastal erosion. Then you have the frequency of droughts and floods in East Africa that are not only threatening food production, but also threatening energy production, because for those depending on hydroelectricity, when there is a hard drought, the level of water goes down in the dam in the way that they can no longer generate electricity. All of that has a huge impact on the economy. So it's important, as we rethink of our economic strategies, to bring in sustainability, to bring in serious consideration to climate change and build, for example, climate resilient infrastructure. And this is one of the things that actually help a city like Beira in Mozambique to be protected in some ways from the cyclone last year. Some of the infrastructure that was climate resilient is what helped in, protecting part of the city, but the city was terribly ravaged by that cyclone Ida. So that question of sustainability is so important in our future growth strategies.
Well, Dr. Zeufack, this has been an absolute pleasure for us. We are really indebted to you, and thank you very much for making your time, making this time available. Please, any last comments, last closing remarks for us?
Just to thank you and really congratulate you on the wonderful work you and your foundation are doing on the ground. And I just want to end where I started, by really calling on Africans and populations to take the COVID threat extremely seriously. At a personal level, I've lost a friend to COVID a couple of weeks ago. I know this is real, okay? And I think it's important for all of us to take this seriously, to implement all the distanciation measures, hand washing. My own foundation in Cameroon is helping with masks, with hand washing stations, and trying to help populations to be shielded. The Mafuntukum Foundation in the area of Chang is doing that in Cameroon. We need to take this extremely seriously. And we need to get our government organized to get the right fiscal space to fight this. But we will not have the fiscal space just by looking abroad. We would have to get it from inside as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zeufack, and thanks to all our attendees and everyone who has joined us and helped prepare and make this really such a wonderful conversation that is really timely. We are bringing experts like Dr. Zeufack to talk about how we respond to COVID and how we reposition the continent. And please join us in a couple of weeks. We'll be honored to have Dr. John Kengasong, who is the director of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Ethiopia. Dr. Kengasong will be joining us on the 29th, I think. And other African experts will be joining us as well, as we think about how best for Africans to respond to the pandemic. We have a coronavirus task force at the Institute. So please, if you would like to help contribute to the response, please join and get in touch with us through the website, Nkafu.org. And with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us. And please have a good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much, Dr. Zeufack, and thanks to the team for making this happen.
Thank you so much, Denis, and good night to you all. Thanks.
Thank you.